This video is made possible by CuriosityStream and Nebula. Watch another brand new full-length companion video to this one in my ongoing Modern Conflicts series that explains the entire course of the 2008 Russian invasion of Georgia, as well as the entire war so far between Russia and Ukraine since 2014 in the Donbass, all of which you can access by signing up for the CuriosityStream Nebula bundle deal for less than $15 a year at curiositystream.com/real-life-lore. Throughout the past few months, there has been almost constant news and coverage in the West about Russia's imminent plans to invade Ukraine.
Started large-scale military drills this morning.
And this is a very dangerous moment.
Stoking fears of an invasion.
More than 2,000 troops, according to American intelligence, sent within the 24 hours.
American citizens should leave now.
On the morning of February the 24th, these fears proved to be well-founded. Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, effectively declared war on Ukraine and authorized the Russian military to invade the country. Explosions were quickly reported afterwards across the country, and immediately prior to this declaration, the Russian army had amassed around 200,000 soldiers, along with their tanks, artillery, equipment, and field hospitals across their border, and many others inside of Belarus along their border with Ukraine. For comparison, this is nearly the same size as the entire Ukrainian military, and about the same number of troops sent by the United States when invading Iraq in 2003. This is certainly large enough to be an effective invasion force. Even further, the Russian government has recognized the independence of the two breakaway states inside of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, and ordered Russian troops inside of both. When factoring in the Russian military presence already stationed in Crimea, you can quickly begin seeing that the Russians have Ukraine almost entirely surrounded. And now that war has broken out, it has the potential to unleash the most serious conflict seen in Europe since the Second World War. And the biggest question on everybody's mind this entire time has been this: what exactly does Vladimir Putin and Russia want with Ukraine? And the answer is, of course, it's complicated. The origins of what Putin wants today are rooted in what happened more than 3 decades ago, back in the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union first collapsed. For centuries before this event, whether as part of the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, the modern countries we know of today as Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and others had all been a part of the same country, and their people had largely moved between all of them across generations. These places are all deeply and intimately connected by their shared history, and for decades, that history involved being widely recognized as one of the world's most dominant and formidable global superpowers. But all of that changed in late 1991, when, suddenly, the sweeping United Empire that had existed in some form or another for centuries collapsed, and left in its place 15 newly independent republics. Today, the largest of them, Russia, has only half of the population that the former United Soviet Union had, and she possesses an economy that's only moderately larger than Spain's, a country with only a third of the population that ceased being a great power back in the 18th century. At the same time, the massive amounts of territories that were once dominated from the central government in Moscow have been shrinking almost continuously ever since. During the Cold War, there were two rival competing military alliances on the European continent: the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in the West, and the Warsaw Pact in the East. Moscow didn't outright rule the countries of the Warsaw Pact, but they were effectively locked into Moscow's orbit as thralls or puppet states. From Moscow's perspective, these states provided a massive buffer against any potential military incursion from their primary Cold War rivals to the West in NATO. You see, from the Netherlands in the west to the Ural Mountains in the east, this whole part of Europe is dominated by a geographic feature called the North European Plain. Almost entirely flat, the plain is shaped like a funnel, with a very narrow width in northern Germany, but with a mouth that opens up increasingly wider as it approaches the Ural Mountains. As the open plain gets wider across the east, it becomes increasingly difficult to defend across its entire length. And as a result, from the perspective of any regime based in Moscow, regardless of the time period and regardless of the ideology, it is imperative to expand control westwards across as much of this open plain as possible in order to narrow the gap that they need to defend in the event of a conflict with the West. During the Cold War, the control of this plain by a regime in Moscow was at its greatest historical extent, and was exerted either outright or by proxy from the Urals all the way through East Germany, and the entire wider section of the funnel was firmly controlled by Moscow, with Austria and Finland remaining neutral and Yugoslavia a non-aligned communist state. The only fronts that Moscow at the time had to truly worry about against NATO were across the Sudeten Mountains, the Black Sea, and a narrow line across the North European plain in central Germany, all easily defensible positions. Any invasion of the Soviet world from the west across these geographic frontiers would have been incredibly difficult. But in the 30 years since 1991, the situation has changed dramatically against Moscow's favor. Today, the former Warsaw Pact territories of East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria are all a part of NATO, while the former Soviet republics themselves of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia all are as well. This reality has pushed the NATO front lines significantly further to the east, across the wider section of the North European plain, and has separated Russian territory between the mainland and the Kaliningrad exclave here, across what's known as the Suwalki Gap. If you're sitting in the Kremlin in Moscow and you still believe that NATO is a hostile military alliance, or could become one in the future, then this situation understandably looks pretty grim. But it's not totally lost yet. In the years following the breakup of the Soviet Union, many of the newly independent republics established and joined their own military alliance called the Collective Security Treaty Organization, or CSTO, which in Europe consists of Russia, Belarus, and Armenia, but not Ukraine, which has remained a sort of neutral zone between NATO in the west and the CSTO in the east. And now, within this lens, you can easily see why Ukraine is currently and always will be a geographic core interest to Moscow. If Ukraine is within Moscow's orbit, then it pushes the CSTO's and Moscow's defensive lines to the Carpathian Mountains in the southwest, and it narrows their exposure across the North European plain to only the eastern border of Poland. And while the Baltic states do lie across the plain as well, CSTO forces could easily encircle them by rapidly advancing across the narrow Suwalki Gap between Kaliningrad and Belarus, and cut them off from the rest of NATO, meaning that they aren't as grave of a geographical threat. Conversely, however, if Ukraine became a NATO member state, it would surge the NATO front lines far beyond the Carpathian Mountains and far across the wider section of the North European plain, and place the new defensible front line across nearly 2,300 kilometers of open, hard-to-defend, flat land, the easternmost section of which would only be a little more than 300 kilometers away from Volgograd, which, if taken, would shut down the entire Volga River and cut off Russia's valuable oil and gas resources coming up from around the Caspian Sea from the rest of the country, as nearly happened during the Second World War, back when the city was better known as Stalingrad. Even further, Belarus, a friendly and loyal CSTO state that is often considered a mere extension of Moscow itself, would suddenly become an indefensible salient protruding deep into the NATO front lines, surrounded entirely by NATO territory on 3 flanks. Thus, Ukraine's outright control by Moscow, or at least neutrality, is essential to the defense of the CSTO and Russia, if you believe that NATO is a hostile aggressor or could become one in the future. But all of this is really only the beginning of what Russia and Putin want from Ukraine. The biggest thing they